Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Singularity Watch, a show where we keep our eyes and brain trained on the future of technology. I'm Ollie, and my host is Kavya Perlman, founder of the XR Safety Initiative, XRSI, award-winning cybersecurity professional and inventor of this timeline. This is the first episode of Singularity Watch, and our very first guest has been awarded the Nextant Rising Star Prize 2020. Now, this prize is awarded annually by Virtual World Society. And I quote, "to those people whom others can turn to for inspiration, guidance, and role modeling, and who have exhibited a passion for building the best future reality possible for our civilization." So that sounds pretty amazing. The name of our guest is Sophia Batchelor. How are you doing,
Hello.
Sophia?
I'm really good. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here.
Awesome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our very first edition of Singularity Watch. So you're the very first, and welcome aboard.
Thank you.
You're clearly someone who gets around quite a lot. From New Zealand to San Francisco Bay and then to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
And you've ranged from XR projects aimed at rehabilitation, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
To brain-computer interfaces.
Yes.
Do you think you could tell us a bit more about your journey and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. See, I always like to start by saying, as you said, I'm from New Zealand, so I have a very strong Kiwi accent that follows me wherever I am. And the reason I start there is because it's really shaped what I hope to bring into the world, and also why I do what I do. So, you know, when I was a teenager, I'm from Christchurch, New Zealand, and there was a big earthquake. And after which, you know, I saw a city absolutely decimated by a natural disaster that we had no way to understand or to protect against. And so I wanted to go to medical school to be able to do more and to help people because I saw so much preventable suffering. So when I graduated high school, that was my whole life plan. I was also an athlete. And so when I was kind of making these early career decisions, I got the opportunity to come over to America to swim in college. And I knew that for me, you know, going out of New Zealand, seeing more of the world would make me a better doctor. So I came to California, Berkeley, and at least that's where I started my degree. And it was kind of at Berkeley that I started to get a little bit more interested in psychology first, a little bit of mechatronics, physics classes, as most undergrads do. They kind of go out and see more of the world and meet people, and you suddenly dream bigger dreams. So from there, I started getting interested in neuroscience and did some wet lab work. I transferred over to Florida to follow a professor and do research. From there, I actually went out to Canada, continued doing research. And then I went back to New Zealand after I got injured and had to retire from sport. And that was really where a lot of the rehabilitation thing came in. So, you know, up until that point, I was still very interested in like psychology and cognitive neuroscience. But when I got injured, I couldn't walk for a very long time.
Right.
And so when
yeah,
it was a massive life pivot for me. And so I started working in spinal rehabilitation and picking up a lot of the cases that were falling through the cracks because I fell through the cracks the same way. And all of the guiding principles of why I wanted to go into medicine followed me into rehabilitation. And it was when I was working there that I first saw virtual reality being used for stroke rehab, looking at, you know, kind of the gamification aspect of getting people through the rehab. And I started to kind of fall in love with this technology and what it could do and how it could connect us. And so when I came back to Berkeley after I was having a right old time in, you know, normal life with a job, needed to finish the degree I'd started. So I came back to Cal, and that was when I actually pivoted completely away from medicine and into technology. I think I just fell so deeply in love with the technology itself, for what it could do. And that's when I, you know, built VR at Berkeley. That's when I think there were a few nights where I was, you know, up until 11 and then like up again at 6 a.m. and I was so happy and I felt really fulfilled. And so that was really, again,
so you found your calling basically at that stage.
I found my calling. I think so, yes. And so, yeah, graduated, loved it. and that I was doing a lot of stuff with my neuroscience background and getting into brain-computer interfaces. I was working in several neuroscience labs, and then I went over to New York to work at a brain-computer interface company before coming over to Leeds in England. So I'm half in London, half in Leeds, working kind of at this intersection of technology and neuroscience.
Right.
Wonderful.
Okay, so that's quite a journey.
Yeah, I don't know if that answers more questions or, asks them.
That's actually, there's a lot to take in. But were you always into immersive tech, or was that just only when you found out sort of about the gamification of rehab and started to sort of see the potential?
It was really when I saw the stroke rehab, and I think I saw the gamification of it and I just wasn't satisfied.
Right.
It's funny, a few years ago I went home for Christmas and someone asked me if I was still messing around with that computer stuff. When I was younger, like technology, the tech world, computers were not something no one ever expected me to go into it.
Okay.
So it was really a different thing for a lot of people to wrap their heads around why I would be falling in love with it. But saw a lot of the work that Skip Rizzo was doing. And again, this is why I bring up Christchurch, is because my city was decimated by an earthquake. And a lot of my friends and my family have medical refractory PTSD. And so it doesn't want treatment. And I saw the work that had been done with VR to treat PTSD, and I thought, if I could understand this technology better, I could bring it home to Christchurch and help. And then the more and more I researched what we knew and what had been done, the more I saw a massive gap in our understanding in very first principle. The way I described it was that we were flying a plane for capacity. We weren't pilots, we weren't air traffic controllers. That is what we were doing with the technology, and I really wasn't satisfied with that. I thought we could be doing better.
Some people say that the first description of what immersive reality might, be like in the future was in 1935. There was a short story called Pygmalion Spectacles. And since then, loads of novels and stories and films have focused on how the human brain interacts with perceived and virtual realities. From what I've understood, your goal is to discover how humans react to immersive technology in order to unveil what it means to be human, and so that we can use technology to benefit us. Now, of course, that's a very generic statement, but does that more or less describe your purpose?
Yes, I think it does. It's I don't know if it describes my purpose, because what I believe my kind of North Star is, I genuinely think that the world can be brighter for many of the people in it. I think, we live in a society that, in many countries has huge amounts of inequality. And so I think that's more like my purpose. But what the things that I love to understand, and I will stay up late at night reading, is this: what does it mean to see? What is learning? What is us? The way I kind of describe it is that the world exists, whether I'm in, VR or whether I'm sitting on my couch right now, I can just out the corners of my headset, I can see the couch beside me, I can see the table in front of me, those are coming to me via, light, whether that be a wave or a particle. So photons are hitting my eyes, and then the brain transcribes and transposes and interprets, those signals. And through that composition, therefore the world exists. We call this the perception, action, and cognition loops. That's really kind of what centers around my PhD, and what I try and understand from a neuroscience point of view.
Right. So the question I was getting to is that, some say that technology and innovation makes us less human and perhaps is in some way cold and heartless, which is kind of a common sort of stereotype.
Yep.
The question was going to be, do you think there's any truth to that? And in general, how would you answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? You've sort of answered a bit, and from what I understand, you're basically saying that the idea that we have of identity is of something fixed, but in actual fact, it's something that we recreate every second, and perhaps it's kind of an illusion. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think I try and stay away from the whole reality is an illusion, just because it goes down a rabbit hole, but it truly is. Everything that we're perceiving happens with some sort of latency, because they're all signals. Everything that we are can technically be boiled down to signal processing, but also, the brain is nonlinear and it's a dynamic system. It has emergent properties, and we call that consciousness. So this whole thing of, with all technology, everything is always going to be dual use. The Adam Savage's quote, "Every tool's a hammer." And so
Yeah.
while we talk about like, oh, how dare you go to an art gallery and sit on your phone the whole time? It's like, oh, but I was looking up the history of this painter. I was looking at the historical relevance of this sculpture that had been stolen by by this person at this point in time. I was looking at to enrich in my experience. And so, we use these terms like augmented reality and virtual reality, mixed reality. But at the end of the day, without ascribing to any too tight a metaphysical kind of school of thought, reality is as much of how we interact and what we make of it. And so I like to use the term of human-computer interaction, humane computer interaction, is that these technologies can be used to connect us so much more, so much deeper. They can help us understand ourselves. They can help us express ourselves. It is a different medium. And that's what I love about, I love about VR especially, is that, what we can see with Tilt Brush is an incredible expression of art. There are people who have, come from still life paintings. There are people who have come from sculpture or architecture who now have a world building tool at their feet. And I really feel like that's what these technologies can be, world building.
Yeah. That's actually kind of interesting, because when you think of the fact that even things that we don't consider technology anymore, but in their day were technologies, like the discovery of dyes for painting, those were something maybe people at that time were saying, oh, what's this? It's some new fad or something. But it actually became the driving force behind what is now considered classical and Renaissance art and everything like that.
Yeah,
so,
I think it's stained glass window. And what they did during the Renaissance age, and how much they were able to express a mood or something very deep about our society, is that the way in which night skies have been depicted through multiple different mediums. And now, we have a night sky above us in a virtual world. So I really do feel like this technology can allow us to express what it means to be ourselves and what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You've made that sort of, I felt that.
I'm glad. Yeah, it's something I feel really deeply. And again, there are also massive drawbacks with these technologies, and we're still understanding. We're fumbling more than we're succeeding, but I do have a great hope for this. So, yeah.
From what I understand, you're currently researching how we could use immersive technology to seek out and modify patterns that affect long-term social and economic prospects of children, which is really pretty cool.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more, and where that could, how impactful that could be? Where could it lead to?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and give like the whole picture and then narrow down into the specifics. So I'm working on the Bourne and Bradford data set, which is why I came to England instead of staying in the States. Is that Bradford is a city that has again a huge wealth disparity, which means that we have children who grow up in incredibly deprived conditions, as well as very, very wealthy ones. And, we get to study them in the same school setting. There are systems in our bodies. I like to describe them as the axle of a car. Your car can't really work very well without an axle. And it's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And it really is like the axis of the car. It keeps everything to go. What that does is produces and moderates cortisol. So I'll try and talk a little bit sciencey, and I promise there's a point to this in a little bit.
That's okay.
Go for it.
So it moderates and produces cortisol, which again is a stress hormone. But we think of a stress as bad, but cortisol is what wakes us up in the morning. It moderates hunger. It also moderates inflammatory responses. So we see very high rates of asthma and autoimmune disorders in this population. Another, we found one of the big studies on the HPA axis came out of California from Kaiser Permanente. And so what I started finding during my undergraduate and then, my last thesis was that the way in which we encode memory, specifically procedural memory, so an action, so like learning how to ride a bike,
Right.
or driving a car, that's procedural memory that comes implicit. If you had to think about all the things you did while driving a car, the same way that you did the first time you ever drove a car, driving a car would be very difficult, far more difficult than we have, but we have these things, we have skills and we have habits that we build upon so that we don't always have to be, in this very active recall state. And what I found is that skills learned, these procedural skills, implicit, so unaware, when we learn them in virtual reality, we actually learn them faster and we learn them better, and they transfer to the natural world.
So
And it was-
if we wanted to clarify this for the
Yeah.
sort of more casual watcher or listener, so
Mhm.
if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that the first stage of learning is you have your attention on the
Yep.
skill, you have a more cognitive approach to it, and then it becomes
Think about
automatic,
learning
right?
yeah. So think about
Right.
you're trying to remember the keys, you're trying to remember where your hands, on all the chords,
Right.
and then eventually, you just kind of build on that skill learning. So exactly that. So if we take that same thing, if we're learning a guitar potentially, in a virtual reality setting, it may be superior. And what I've been doing is trying to push and understand why is it better, but
Yeah,
also
I was going to ask.
yeah,
That's
and
a really interesting question. Is it? Do you think
Yeah.
it's to do with the gamification or to do with the sort of heavy stimulus bombardment on the?
So I would lean towards the second, the heavy stimulus, but I want to unpack that a little bit more. So, we have these terms that Mel Slater decided to define a while ago, like immersion and presence, and people kind of spin these out quite often. But what do they actually mean? So what I do instead is I try and interpret these technologies on a scale of net sensory input. Like right now I have my controllers, they have some haptics, but they have pretty bad haptics in them. I'm in a headset, and so, I don't have spatialized audio on. And so the more input that we're putting into our bodies, the more signals we're giving it, potentially the brain might be encoding this differently. Why?
Right.
That's why I decided to do a PhD and not go into industry.
Okay.
Because it's a very fundamental question.
So that's a really big. I mean, I could literally open up so many questions on this now. I'm going to press on with the questions because it's incredibly interesting, but I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent there.
No problem. Back to the kids. I'll try and give a 60 seconds. So the reason why it's Bradford, all of these things about how is the brain learning differently in VR. Technology has always been an incredible tool for social mobility. So one side of it is really, being able to teach these kids, to empower them, to enable them. And then the other thing is, again, that fundamental question of, what could we deliver and teach better in an environment with our brains are going to be able to receive and to integrate that information so much more. So my goal is to even the playing field as much as I can in my time here, and reduce, the long-term effects, either by, the rundown effect of an HPA axis, whether or not that's social mobility through education, or whether or not, again, it is this skill learning. So imagine if we learned about atomic dynamics and chemistry and physics in a three-dimensional space as opposed to on pen and paper.
That is so admirable.
Yeah, it's really it's something that manages to be admirable and interesting, which is not always the case. There's many jobs that one or the other.
I'm very lucky. I love what I do. I really do.
Yeah, we can tell. We know that there's been a growing presence of BCI, that's brain-computer interface for anyone listening or watching, tech in the consumer market in the last few years. Considering the nature of this technology and how fast it's growing, what do you think its potential is likely to be, if you just had to say a few sort of keywords, kind of, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, what would you reckon that could be in terms of what we'd actually see on the market for the general public?
The first thing is effective computing. So computers and systems that understand where you are, that understand your context, and that can meet you where you are and get you to where you want to be.
Wow.
If you walk in a room after a bad day, imagine, we know the effects of lighting on our mood and on our affect. So imagine if you work the same way that you go to a fancy restaurant and somehow the ambience is just right. We already have a lot of smart home tools, but what if it actually knew where you were? I see it as a communication tool. Instead of me struggling with language, it's like, oh, I'm feeling off, I'm feeling weird. I'm kind of, I don't quite know what I'm feeling. Our brains are the things feeling that, and so actually being able to identify those patterns, enabling us to change that and to get us to where we want to be. So you see a lot of apps like that enhanced flow that look at your alpha power and where it is in your brain, and so we call that flow, or you call that focus, and so apps that actually inform you, so biofeedback. I also see it's very topical with Neuralink, but I do see this embodiment and this integration with the ways in which you can offload computational power and know where you are. So if you look at, cognitive fatigue, if you are getting sleepy at the wheel, and that's the cue for an autonomous system to come support your driving, is that instead of a human in the loop system, it's a robot in the loop system. You are still in control because it is still your brain. And then the last being accessibility and the medical use cases, which is what we have with Neuralink. If you think about it, oh my gosh, the word's not coming to mind. A cochlear implant, there you go. Cochlear implants are brain-computer interfaces, but we just forget that and don't put it in the same category, but that's what we're doing. We're stimulating the nerves.
I think a lot of people have an idea of BCI as something that can read your thoughts and stuff like that, rather than a biofeedback mechanism or something to know kind of how you're feeling from body signals and stuff like that.
Exactly.
So I think for a little bit, it's scary in a way, but...
And that's the whole thing. It's like, if I thought that someone could read my mind at any second of the day, I would be terrified too. But going back to one of your first questions about, what is it that makes us human, is that what is a thought? We don't know at what point a neuron, the electrical signals between two neurons compute. We don't know, how it computes. But also we don't know, it's called the mapping problem if you want to Google it. At what point neuron to neuron, pathways, networks, maps, systems, we don't know at what point that becomes us.
Right. And so, and maybe it's, do you think that's an important question, or is it something that humans are obsessed with just because they need some kind of sense to be given to things?
I think it's a very important question, because I think that it will allow us to build a technology that can support, and again, that comes back to the last case, so what we saw with Neuralink is decoding motor movement. So motor imagery and motor intent is one of the largest applications for BCIs currently. You see that with, ALS, so being able to support control and motor movement, and being able to pick up the event-related potentials to give them a voice, to help them, communicate.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we understood not just an ERP, so not just a few neurons in a specific area firing, and that using that and training that on a system as a selection tool. So I have, letters, and I'm like, I want that letter in, the upper right-hand quadrant. Instead being able to think a word. And so instead of it being like APPLE, apple, I am thinking apple. Yeah, and I am inputting that and being able to communicate that to you or to anybody else. And that is different from a thought, because, thought, intention, BCIs, you can't just wear something on your head and have it passively read all of your thoughts.
Right,
the brain is electrical activity. There needs to be sense in there.
speaking of the general public, that brings me to a question on a topic that is especially important to the focus on this show, which will obviously be something that comes out later on with future episodes. With the mass adoption of emerging technologies such as XR and BCI and all the rest that we don't even know is coming, the increase in data collection and processing, there are, like with all new technologies, certain risks and challenges in front of us. So one of these concerns is data protection and privacy. And if we look back at the past decade, we've seen the potential of data as a political tool, more and more relevant, in fact. And there is now some significant foreshadowing of the potential impact of biometrically inferred data. So depending on the amount and quality of data we can get hold of from our brains, what kind of caution, awareness, and rules do you think we need?
I think we need immense caution. And I think that this is, and again, my opinions are somewhat controversial within different communities. And possibly that is because, I've come from a medical background where, we swear a Hippocratic oath.
Right.
Is that, these technologies are getting closer and closer to us on our bodies. We're starting to wear smart watches, we're starting to wear smart glasses. We're starting to wear things that, can detect intentionality if it has been trained to do it. And as we're starting to wear them on us, they're becoming more a part of us. And so I think that and again, it would be incredibly difficult to implement, but I realize that there are ways to do it.
Right.
It's ways that, I go into extensively. I think there needs to be an equivalent for these types of technology because it is biometric data. And if it is biometric data in the same way that we have, HIPAA to protect your medical data,
Right.
and that's something that I really strongly believe, and I will continue pushing on. The other, I'm in a lot of it. You talk about data privacy, so we've got these things. You've got federated learning, you've got differential privacy, and Apple is very well known for their strong stances on ownership of data, and the ways in which they've backed that up with the development, the design of the secure enclave, especially for your thumbprint, or your Face ID, as we've got to now.
Right.
And I think that in the same way, I was at a company last year that massively took privacy as one of the utmost important things that were important to us as individuals, but also to the company and the company's values. And so there are ways to design these technologies so that they do not violate what we set out as biometric data privacy guidelines or rules or governances. And there are ways to develop technology that abides by those because we did it. And we weren't a massive team. We just cared enough to go to the same thing. And there are other groups, other companies that are doing the same way. The issue is that it is falling on the individuals at the company. It is falling on the founders. It's falling on the developers. And I think we need to be doing better than that. But at the same point, I also want to applaud and celebrate the people who are doing it right, because they are doing such a fantastic job of it. There are groups like Open Mind, as a spin-up out of Oxford, and they have developed a fantastically secure backend that is now implemented on a lot of local of the COVID track and trace apps. I think, being here in the UK, the cluster that was the government's track and trace app is a prime example of what happens when things can go wrong.
Right.
And things can go wrong because there was not adequate forethought. It was very much we just kind of got to do it, and if we intrude on people's privacy and start to brackets. I feel very strongly about empowering users and empowering the general public, empowering people to understand what is being done with their data, which I think is fantastic with GDPR. In the EU, is that it actually gives you the information of what is being what information is being gathered. because it irks me when my parents are like, oh, Facebook already has everything. I'm like, but they don't have to, you know?
Yeah.
Can be doing better, but we live in a world where it is incredibly difficult to use services and to access anything without the big five. And I think that is a massive issue, because not only does it stop, smaller companies with brilliant ideas who are like prioritizing things like data privacy and data protection, it stops them breaking into the market, which means that us as consumers, we don't have options. It's something I have to log in with my Facebook, and I don't really want to do that. And I think that's an area that I think there needs to be more regulation around, opportunity. And again, like I was saying, is that there are technological options. It is just currently there is a issue around the governance and implementation of that because of different restrictions, because we are existing within big monoliths that can control everything.
Yes.
Or not control everything, but control the majority of the ways in which we can interact and use technology.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I think I had another point to say, but I completely forgot what it was. It's too much on my soapbox about this.
So another aspect that we have to consider with every new technology is ethics. What are the ethic boundaries to consider while conducting neural research in particular?
A lot. There's whether or not it's in a private setting, a public setting, or an institutional or university setting. Generally, neural research is a biometric one, and if you want to conduct it well and ethically, then you will need ethics approval from an advisory group or an internal review board. And generally, an institution or a big private companies often have their own. And so that's one of the first things, because what that does is assesses what is the risk to the individuals in the study, not just at the time of the research, but also long term. And this ranges from, if you are doing TMS research, so TMS is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So basically, like I said, electricity goes this way, so magnetic field goes this way. So you induce, you bring in a magnetic field, it changes the activity of the brain. That can give people headaches. And I say that as first-hand experience. And you are changing the activity of their brain when you do this, and we call them lesioning studies. And so looking at not just the headache or what you're inducing at the time, but also, will there be any effect 3 days, a month, 6 months, a year down the line? And that's around the personhood, the risk, but also the risk to their psychological well-being. To where they are in context of society. So, if you are giving someone a treatment that may change the way they interact with those around them, and this is incredibly pertinent when we talk about immersive reality, is that are we socializing people in these spaces? How is that going to carry on? We've learned generally, most of us have learned how to interact socially in the real world. And then, going back into the early days of the internet, is that forums were self-organized. But learning how to interact in immersive settings is that we're still in very, very early days, and it's complete Wild West. And so there's that, and that's why you kind of have this first step, and then thinking about what research are you actually doing. There are huge criticisms that I have and that lots of other people have about the popular science research, is that when you conflate, what we talk about is correlation and causation. Just because something's correlated, for example, the number of Nicolas Cage movies, does not mean that the price of cheese in Iowa cause on movies. But you take that to the, it's fun and it's gimmicky, but you take that to the research level, is that people will point to an area of the brain and say, oh, that's the empathy center of the brain, and we see that active when people are in VR. That does not mean that VR is, causes empathy or evokes empathy. And so we need to be very careful about the conclusions that we are gathering from it. So, that's just good research ethics. Be a good researcher. And then there's the other side of things, there's another part of it, which is how are you actually conducting and distributing the research? And this is where we get into data privacy and the ethics for the individuals, that there is a large difference between moral law, ethical law, and judicial law. And understanding the difference between those is that you don't need a bar certified, lawyer advising an ethics group, but it will probably be good to have at least a lawyer on it, in the same way that having someone who is trained in moral ethics is important to have. I believe it is important to have those people instrumental throughout the research process, because it means that you'll be able to have researchers doing what they do best, as well as having an ethicist do what they do best. That's disciplinary teams.
So there's different areas, quite a complex thing to sort of get to in the end, to solve all different areas of the ethics problem.
Well, we exist in a complex world. We exist in a society.
Yeah. I mean,
with these technologies, you can't just slap on a Fitbit and call it a Sunday.
Of course.
It's how it actually integrates with us. And I think looking at these things in isolation is incredibly wrong. Basically, is the bottom line.
Totally.
Yeah.
And in fact, you talk about Fitbit. So, Elon Musk with his Neuralink launch is calling Fitbit, calling the whole Neuralink as the Fitbit for the brain. So, what are your thoughts about that? And how do you even get to analyzing ethics or making sure that we are exploring these things safely? I mean, you kind of hinted at some of these points, but what would be the top 3 things that one could really pursue in this regard?
Yeah, so I have large qualms with, Elon's a visionary. And Neuralink was this big secret company where no one knew what they was working on, which meant they could do anything. And then last year's announcement, we saw that they were just looking at, an implant in the motor cortex to restore motor function. And that's when I became, not so much to get on board with it, but I was like, that is a use. Because we need to be looking at how these technologies are going to be used by people and implemented. Same thing as I was mentioning the cochlear implant earlier, is that if you're looking at a medical grade research that is going in the brain, you're looking at a surgical risk, which carries huge risk, especially neurosurgery, once you penetrate the inner table of the skull. Mm-hmm. And so you need to be assessing, if we are putting someone at this higher risk, what is the trade-off? Is it because they have lost limb function due to a stroke or due to, a traumatic brain injury? And are we trying to do that? Same thing with cochlear implants, is that if someone has, they're hearing impaired, are we willing to risk a very invasive surgery to restore this thing? Which kind of begs that ethical question of, what does it mean to be human? Do we need to have supersonic hearing? Do we need to be able to jump, higher than we currently can? Or are we as we are? And that's something that when you have a use and you think about is someone making a choice with autonomy and of their own volition, so not coercion. Is that we have not seen very many implants go into different individuals since the 1990s was really when we started looking at this. And it's just because we don't really know how the brain works. We don't know what a thought is. We don't know how we imagine things. We don't know how memory works. Understanding and identifying use, and I think that is where Neuralink is going right. I think they have identified this as a therapeutic use case, and there are other companies doing the same.
Here at XRSI, this is kind of what we're pursuing, is trying to help build safe, immersive realities. And now with the launch of, or at least the public launch of Neuralink, it's clear that we are literally exploring the cross-section of artificial intelligence,
Mhm.
immersive realities, and brain-computer interfaces. Right at this moment, we're also building privacy framework for spatial computing at XR. And at the moment, version 1 is still focused on human-centric design, human-centric privacy. But right, I wonder if ethics is still sufficient. I wonder if we have to push a little bit more towards regulation and safety concerns, because that I can get people on board with. So as we do this, what do you think, Sophia? Should we be only advocating about ethical, or should we be more leaning towards regulation? What could be like the 2, 3 things that I should keep in mind, or XRSI should keep in mind as we help build safe immersive realities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's good because the term ethics is incredibly abstract. Like, what does it mean? How do you do ethical research? Which again was why we're actually writing this section in the Turing Way. And so how do you break it down? And when you talk about regulations, regulation is something that is incredibly concrete. I think one of the issues with regulation is the same thing that we're having with legislation, is that it cannot keep up with the rate of change of technology. It cannot cover all the bases. And so I like to lean more towards governance, more so than regulation, just because, even within living documents, it's not quite as fast as they need to be. So use the term human-centric principles, first principles, and I think that is where you should always start from. Start from like, what is the person going to experience? And what is the people around them? Is that so? You asked a question earlier about what should we be worried about as well? Is that there was a big collaboration, Berkeley, Stanford. It was all great. What we were trying to understand is that if I was looking at Kava and you're kind of over here, how much information can I pick up just from passive gaze about you? And with over 80% accuracy, we got gender with over, this was a while ago now, so I'm gonna have to go back and read the study, but everything was above 85%, and again high 90s about like your height, your weight, your interactions, your mobile. Like we can people in the same way that when we can recognize someone's by their footsteps, people type differently. Is that we're using typing patterns to unlock laptops, and that was I want to say 2015 high paper we've been able to do this for ages. And so the amount of information that we can get from third-party people who have not given permission for us to access their data, and I think that having a human-centered principles, not just about the people in the space, but also everyone who enters the space around it, and that is about information. And again, I don't think that a regulation can do that, because it's often not written in a language that is accessible to everybody. And so having this is what you are signing up for when you enter the space, and having information, I think I really love conferences and giving talks, because I get to learn about, what research other people are doing. That's where I learned about the fact that people can use typing to unlock their laptop, because everyone has individual typing systems. I think in that same way, I think that's something that I would love to see XRSI really, really take a lead on, because it's a fantastic organization that's got some really good initiatives. I think keeping to move in that direction will be fantastic.
Here comes the sort of special question of the final question of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And as our very first guest, you get to sort of imprint this. A concept that has many interpretations and ideas attached to it is that of singularity, which is of course part of the name of the show.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone sees something slightly different in this word. Does singularity mean something to you? If so, what, and how close are we to a technological singularity, and what would that even look like?
I think that I will give my own opinion on it, because again, I have my own vision for the world and my own meaning for it, which disagrees with some and agrees with others. Is that I see a world where we can interact and interface with information that is spatial, that is accessible, and that is democratic and freely available. And the singularity for me is that interaction point. And what that requires is technology that understands us and has an entry point. You know, you look at the Minority Report, obviously no one wants an interface like the Minority Report. You know, the visual cues are way off, everything, like no one, it's going to be an ergonomic nightmare. But we need to interact with this information somehow. And that somehow, I think, is going to be the tie-in with the singularity, is that when I, same way that I fly drones using motor imagery of my brain. So I think right and the drone flies right. I think left, the drone flies left. Up, down, forward, back.
That must be amazing.
It's really fun. I'm currently trying to do multi-drone control, but I keep flying them into walls and then breaking them. But this is what I'm talking about. That's the singularity. Is that the point at which it's not that, you know, it's not a generalized intelligence, it's not a one-shot learner. It is a way in which to interact with information in the form of like technology that is seamless and that is us. You know, if I want to read an essay or I want to get information from an essay, but I've been reading a textbook all day, I need to get the information in a different way. You look at productivity, you know, you've got Roam, you've got Notion, you've got MyMind, you've got all of these. Those are currently working towards that point, which I would call the singularity. They're, you know, offloads for our minds. But they are also, they're not just offloading, they are integrating. They are part of us, they are our minds. And I think that is what I believe technological advancement can be. That is what I would like to see, that is what I like to work on. And that is also why accessibility is that I would want someone who is visually impaired to have the exact same access to information as I do, not being visually impaired. I want someone in, you know, Beirut having access to the exact same textbook, or I was in a summer school and the Iranian students almost couldn't do the summer school because of restrictions. I would want a student who has just as much excitement and love for neuroscience as I do to be able to have access to the same information as I do in order to bring brightness and vibrance to the world. That's not a singularity, that is just a tool that we're using in order to achieve something. And I think that what we're trying to achieve is that singularity point.
I think you've basically helped us to understand some things better and also have a lot more questions. I imagine anyone watching or listening will be, you know, thinking, oh, right, now I've got to look up about 10 things and figure out what...
I was trying to give as many questions as I could throughout. I was like, if you want to look up the mapping problem, just Google Scholar, the mapping problem, it will explain it well. But yeah, that's... Everything should always spawn more questions, and there's
absolutely
information out there. And same thing with the optimism, is that like, we are the ones creating this future, and so if we're only seeing a dystopian future, then we're only going to build tools that are
it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would keep you here for a lot longer, but we're going to wrap up now. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, virtually speaking, and I wish you all the best in your efforts. And in particular, I think it's great that what you're doing is aimed at helping people. That's something that, you know, on a very personal level, I like to see when, you know, you interview someone. It's not just about money and, you know, and just, you know, achieving something, but it's about actually doing something good for the world. And I think everybody here feels that way, even the people that the viewers or listeners can't see who are our team. And also huge thanks to Ready Hacker One for making this show happen, and to the team who are over there. Well, not all of them, but most of them. One got shut out. And they will be gradually revealing themselves in various forms in the future. For now, they remain a mysterious entity. So you're going to have to... to everyone viewing or listening, this is just the beginning of the journey. You can follow us on readyhacker1.com. That's all together, obviously, because there's no spaces in internet addresses. You can watch our shows on YouTube. Listen to the podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Podcast. And that's it. Happy journeys to all of you.